Hey everyone, welcome back to the garage. I've been happily driving my Project BMW E30 for the past month or so without any real issues coming up. Well, that's aside from a rough idle that's resurfaced on the car. Now, when I first went through this car, I cured all of the vacuum leaks that I was aware of. I hooked up my vacuum leak tester smoke machine and I thought I caught them all. Well, after using the car, something has come up and I have to dig deeper into this thing to see what's causing the idle to be a bit rough. So let's hook up our smoke tester and see if we can figure out the issue. So what I'm first going to do is remove the airbox assembly and the mass airflow sensor so I can hook up my handy dandy smoke tester to see if we can find the vacuum leak. So let's get this out of the way. Okay, so the smoke machine is heating up and eventually this tube will fill with white smoke, and if there's any leaks in this intake system, we're going to see it start pouring out. So it's just a waiting game. Now, to see how well this smoke machine works, let's go take a look at the back of the car. So most of the smoke is making its way back out the exhaust through the open exhaust valve, so you can tell the smoke is getting through the whole system here. So any leaks along the way will be seen either somewhere. All right, I'm starting to see it come out around this area. Let's check it out. Look down in here, and this is going to be hard to see, no doubt, on the camera, but right where the throttle position sensor is, I can see a stream of smoke coming out. So it's presumably coming from the throttle plate shaft, the actual butterfly valve, the shaft that goes from the top to the bottom, supported by bearings. Supposedly there's seals there. I would guess that those seals are gone. So now we know where our leak is coming from, and now it's time to just see if we can actually fix it. All right, let's take the throttle body off. Okay, so the first thing we've got to do with the throttle body on the bench is remove our throttle position sensor. If you're not sure how to set up this throttle position sensor, I recommend putting some match marks on either side of it so you can line it up. Really, it's pretty easy to get set up, so I'm just going to go ahead and take it apart without doing that. You want to have some sort of catch bin to put all your screws, because there's quite a lot of little things that come apart on this throttle body here. Alright, so the next thing we're going to want to do is remove these screws that hold the throttle plate onto the throttle shaft. Now, I've taken this out before, but if you haven't taken this out before, be very careful with these screws. They self-thread into the shaft itself. If you look on the back side, you'll see that they come through this side, and they're in there pretty tight. I'm using a JIS screwdriver, which fits in these Phillips heads really tightly, and it doesn't require you to put a lot of pressure on there to actually unscrew them. So, you want to unscrew these. Now again, if this is your first time removing these, you might see metal shards come out the other end because those are the threads from the throttle shaft itself. You'll want to deburr that before you reassemble all of this. Okay, so we'll turn this so we can slip the throttle plate out. Now, if you haven't cleaned your throttle body in a long time, you might want to clean it before you try to pull this plate out because there's probably going to be a lot of carbon and oil buildup on this thing. So that's out of there. Now next, we want to pull this shaft out. But before we can do that, we have to remove some items on the bottom end of this shaft. So first, there's a little washer on the bottom of here. You might have to get a magnet to pull these out. So there's 2 flat washers, very thin. And then there's this bear of a C-clip type mechanism in there. And I have taken this apart before, so I've already released a lot of the crimping tension that this has on there. But the only way I've found to get this out of there is with a pair of C-clip or circlip style pliers. I had to grind these down so that they would even fit into the crevice here. That's what we're going to use to get that C-clip out of there. You might have to use a small flat blade screwdriver to help pry it out. As you can see, I just kind of stretched the metal out on that C-clip, and now it just kind of slides out. I don't know how else you take this thing out. There's probably a more precise way to do it, but that's the only way I could figure it out. So put that off to the side. Okay, so now this shaft is thoroughly exposed on the other side. It should not allow, or it should allow this to now slide out of the bore there. Now the only thing left to release is this 10mm nut on the top. It's not on there very tight. Okay, now before you do anything further, take a lot of pictures, and I mean of how these 2 mechanisms are oriented with one another. Take a picture of the springs where they clip in to the little tabs on the throttle body itself, because when I took this apart the first time, it took me forever to remember how to put it back together. So just be sure to take lots of pictures of everything, so you know how to reassemble it. So the next step is to start pulling this shaft out of the throttle body, but it gets a little hard because this shaft has to come out as well. So be careful because there are springs wound sort of tight on this. You just slowly start slipping it out. You want to release the springs. There's a washer that goes on top of where that 10mm nut was. Just put that off to the side so you don't lose it. Okay, that's 1 spring released. You can see the tension on the spring was 2 turns. So when it comes time to reassemble it, you got to make sure you wind it 2 times around. It's very tight. I recommend having gloves on for this because it can get your finger and make you bleed pretty bad. Oh, there goes the other spring. Okay, so that's both springs now unwound. Now we can just release this slowly. Now again, if you haven't done this before, it's probably going to be harder to pull this out. Persistence will prevail. Okay, now we have this throttle body shaft mechanism out of the way. Make sure you remember that there's a spring washer on the bottom of this and a spring washer on the top. There's also a washer set on this shaft as well. Just make sure all the washers get back on there. Now, if you remember, the leak was coming from the bottom side of the throttle body, and the reason that leak was happening is because this needle bearing that the shaft rotates on has a rubber seal lip on the inside of it. Well, it used to have a rubber seal lip. Now, I'll be honest, I've already been in here and I've tried to fix this with a DIY home remedy by pulling out that old seal. It had basically turned to plastic. It was just hard and brittle and cracked and no way was sealing anything. So I pried it out with a small screwdriver and then stuffed a similar sized O-ring in there to try and see if I could get this to seal up against that shaft. Well, O-rings aren't supposed to seal in that way. They're not supposed to have a rotating piece within them to create a seal. So that O-ring quickly got damaged and created this leak again. So unfortunately, if you're thinking of fixing this that way, you can't do it. You have to replace these bearings with some new bearings with those seals in it. And luckily, I was able, after a ton of research, I was able to find these original style bearings with the seals in them. So let's take a look at that. So the original bearings in this are made by INA or INA, and they have a single sealing lip on the inside of them. And I looked up the part number on the bearing that's still pressed in here, and I couldn't find anything. But eventually I tracked down a German forum post, translated it, and there within the post were the dimensions of this bearing. I found out that INA still makes these, and they make an uprated style needle rolling bearing. They're called drawn cup needle bearings, and this version has 2 sealing lips per bearing, which is definitely an improvement over the old one. So if we pull this out, here is the new bearing. Now if we look inside there, you'll see that there's a rubber sealing lip on that side and a rubber sealing lip on that side. What this allows this to do is when this shaft slides through, it creates that sealing edge, which is exactly what we want it to do. Now the challenge in all this is pulling the old bearings out of there, because I mean, how do you get that out of this housing? Well, let me show you how I plan to do that. So what I have here is called a blind bearing puller set, and I bought this on Amazon for like 30 bucks or so, which I thought was an awesome deal. And the size that it comes with that I need is this 8mm size, and so you insert this in the middle of the bearing, and then you spin this part and it expands these teeth and it grabs the inside of the bearing. Then you mount this to a slide pull hammer and you just start consistent blows to help extract the bearing from the bore on the throttle body. So that's the theory anyway. I've never tried it before, so let's just hope this works. So let's get this set up. Okay, so an update. This hasn't gone super well. The tool ended up breaking. So you can see the finger there snapped off. There's supposed to be 4 fingers there and it just broke off. Granted, it's a cheap tool, so you get what you pay for. Probably end up returning this. But at the same time of that tool breaking, it also mutilated the bearing in here. So I'm at a point where I can't turn back. I've got to figure out a way to get this bearing out another way. So if we take a look, you can see that bearing is pretty bad. The needle bearing cage I've pried out of there because, well, it was completely mutilated. So I'm left with this outer portion of the bearing stuck in the bore of the throttle body. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully grind down this outer perimeter of the bearing with a Dremel tool and the carbide grinding bit and see if I can just break that circumference and then pry it out of the bore of the throttle body. So let's just see how this goes. Okay, that's probably a deep enough groove to now try and pry this perimeter of the bearing out. Finally got it out. Obviously not the preferred method, but the Dremel tool is the last line of defense in any project when things don't go to plan. But I got the old bearing out, still have one to do. So you can see in the bores of this, obviously I did cut into the aluminum just a tiny bit, and I had to do that so I could cut through the entire band of the steel bearing. I'm going to seal these grinds down with some Permatex #2 when I insert the new bearing, and it'll seal up any air gaps because it'll be a press fit and nothing will be getting through. So not really a big deal. Overall, the bore is still in fine condition. Obviously that took a lot more time than I thought it would take, and now I've got to do the other side. I'm not even going to attempt to use the puller tool because guess what? It broke. So we'll just use the Dremel tool, grind that one out, and pull it out the same way. Alright, so that is the last bearing removed. Again, a little bit of marring on the inside surface, but nothing a little Permatex number 2 on the insertion of the new bearing can't take care of. Alright, so we'll do a light smearing of this Permatex number 2. Now, here is the new bearing made by INA. It's the HK0812-2RS. Again, it is a dual seal style bearing. I want to make sure the lettering is up, and then we can just tap this into place. So those are the new bearings pressed into place. Looks pretty good. Okay, time for reassembly. Now before I do anything, I'm going to put a little bit of grease in the bearings just so things glide in a little bit smoother than without it. Okay, so I've put my washers back on here. I've put these little plastic caps back on. So now it's time to put these shafts back in and the springs, and this is rough, I'm not gonna lie. There's a lot of things to be watching out for. First of all, the edges of this shaft are a little bit sharp, so you have to be very careful, be very gentle inserting it in here because you don't want to rip the new seal that's on that bearing. And also you're trying to line up both of these shafts and the springs at the same time. So let's just give it a shot. Okay, so that's one inserted. Okay, so that's the correct orientation right there. Now it's a matter of winding the springs up before fully seating it into the next bearing. So this is where it gets very challenging. Okay, before I do that, I want to put a little bit of grease on the end of the shaft before it goes into the other bearing. Remember, you got to wind it around not once but twice to get the right amount of tension on the spring, because you have to make sure it has a proper amount of return when you let off the throttle. So, okay, that's one spring wound up. Now, time to do the second one. Okay. Now it's time to slowly slot this back in. And there it goes. It's all the way in. And that is wound up. So actually I wound this spring up twice and this one around only once, because I don't think I could have done it twice without seriously injuring myself, so I just left it like that. But there's plenty of tension on that, so we're good. All right, so there you go. That shaft is now sealed up with that new bearing. Now I want to insert this so that the 4 is on the right side facing towards the back of the throttle body. So, like this. All right, that's the throttle body completely reassembled, and you can hear that the throttle position sensor is correctly adjusted, because if we just barely move the throttle open, that means it is engaging it to come off the idle loop for the computer. So that's set up good there. Now, before I put this back in the car, I need to make a new gasket between the throttle body and the intake manifold. I'm just gonna trace it out onto this gasket making paper and make my own. Throttle body reassembled, new gasket. Let's get this thing back on the car. Okay, with everything hooked back up, all the vacuum lines attached to the throttle body, I'm gonna hook my smoke machine back up to it and see if we have any leaks. Let's do it. Well, the good news is I'm not seeing any sort of leakage. I'm seeing smoke coming out the tailpipe, but nothing in the engine bay. So I think we've actually fixed the problem. Now that is a lot smoother. All right, so there we are. For about 20 bucks, you can rebuild the toughest part of this throttle body, those throttle shaft bearings. Now, the important things behind this were, of course, the two bearings, which I'll put the links to those parts in the description of this video, as well as a tungsten carbide Dremel bit to get the old bearings out. Put a link to one of those in the description as well, so you can try and attempt this yourself. I'm not sure that this procedure is documented anywhere, so hopefully you guys found this video helpful and you don't have to go out and buy a whole new throttle body assembly just to get a completely sealed unit. These are the pieces that are the toughest to seal, and now we know how to fix it. So again, sorry for the long video, but a step-by-step process is always a little bit tedious and long-winded, but now it's documented and you know where to go from here. So I'm sure this isn't the last video on this car. There's always something lurking to go wrong on these E30s just around the corner. But until that happens, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you guys again soon.